Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here with us today. This is the session on science as diplomacy. What now? We have a wonderful group of people around the table, virtual table, so it is. We are going to discuss, of course, about where we are going with science as diplomacy, as scientists. Yes, there is a war in Ukraine. Yes, but there is also a danger geopolitical crisis. The Russian government has launched a classic war of aggression against a neighboring country. It has threatened the West with consequences never seen before in history. It has set their offensive nuclear arsenal on standby and has for years murdered critics in other countries, undermined the West's democratic processes and elections, and conducted cyber espionage against our research centers and universities. So two questions have emerged in academia the last three weeks. The first, of course, being what can we do to help? It's on everybody's mind, and universities across all of Europe are stepping up to do what they can with the resources they have. And I would ask you all to, when this session is over, to go to Science for Ukraine. Just Google it, search, and you will find a website and see how you can, what you can do in order to make the world a little bit better. The second question is, of course, the question we are primarily discussing today, and that is, what does this mean for academia? What does it mean for academic collaboration with Russia? The German Alliance of Scientific Organizations, the Allianz der Wissenschaftsorganisationen, proposed that German research funding no longer would benefit Russia and that joint scientific and research policy events should not take place. The European Commission has suspended cooperation with Russia on research and innovation, while others have argued for continued scientific collaboration, pointing that even at the coldest days of the Cold War, there was always scientific collaboration, and that has a value. So the question is, have we dropped science as diplomacy for now? Does it work? Has it ever worked? Is it appeasement? What about science boycott? Does it work, or is it just a matter of moral disgust? What should we land on now? What is the real political path? What is the ethical path? When is enough enough? Is there a space between academic boycott and academic diplomacy? If so, what is it? And should Europe put its scientific collaboration with Russia and Belarus on hold to sort out what we're going to do now, which is the Norwegian position? Well, together we will discuss it today, here now, and we'll first go around the table and talk a little bit, each and every one of us, and then we will all talk with each other and on top of each other for the last part of the hour. First, Eric Piaget, please. The screen and the microphone is yours.
Oh, thank you very much, Martin. Eric Piaget is my name. I'm a visiting research fellow at the United Nations University in Bruges. Reflecting upon this current tragedy in Ukraine, I'm just worried that scientific cooperation will become yet another innocent victim of this horrible war. I mean, Russia has unleashed horrible suffering on the Ukrainian people. It's shown a vile disregard to the international rules-based system, and it's nudged us perilously close to nuclear conflict for the first time since 1962. And I think our response to that, these all-encompassing sanctions, is warranted, but I do fear in the heat of the moment, sometimes we don't consider the implications of cutting off all scientific collaboration with the Russian Federation. I mean, a lot of the projects that Russian scientists has worked on with the Western counterparts are on issues that go far above geopolitics regarding climate or public health, disease eradication. And by cutting off collaboration with these scientists, it doesn't actually derail the Kremlin's war machine objectives, and it doesn't necessarily aid our objectives in helping Ukraine. And it does hamper our progress as, humanity, essentially. So I think we have to ask these questions and actually apply a very careful criteria to what sort of collaboration exists. It cannot have any sort of dual use technology, and it can threaten our technological sovereignty. But for projects that are aimed at goals that go beyond politics and national borders, and then I think we should be careful about cutting that, because then we are making scientific progress a victim of the war as well. Secondly, it overlooks the science diplomacy's ability to mitigate conflicts. As you rightly said, Martin, it existed throughout the Cold War. Certain countries like Slovenia have said they're going to cut off scientific collaboration with Russia until a peace agreement is signed. And whilst there's currently talks underway that gives way for optimism, the pessimistic view suggests that this is going to be a very long and protracted conflict that will leave Kiev and scores of other Ukrainian cities looking like Grozny did in Chechnya in 2000. And meanwhile, Russia will probably grow more authoritarian and in the orbit of probably China. And who is to say that will sort of compound this bifurcation that's happening in geopolitics. And who's to say there will even be an appetite for scientific collaboration at that point? And meanwhile, as going back in history, during the Cold War, you had Soviet scientists and American scientists working together on polio and smallpox vaccines and space exploration, as illustrated by the handshake in space in 1975, or also nuclear fusion research that helped set the road for the strategic arms limitation talks. I mean, this all set the mood for détente. And then in Cuba as well, you had the Cuban and American meteorologists that were cooperating all throughout that the period from 1959 to 2014, where there was no diplomatic connection. And that was a very important channel that actually made relations better. So what I'm saying is that by cutting off scientific collaboration completely, we are removing channels that can help the reconciliation process. And then finally, there is no appetite for war amongst Russian scientists themselves, as can be seen in this letter, as of last week, that received 7,000 signatures amongst Russian scientists, in great peril to themselves, considering this law from the Duma that threatens up to 15 years in prison for those that don't call it a special military operation. So as a sign of solidarity and as a sign of upholding the principles enshrined in the Lisbon Treaty, I think creating some degree of collaboration is an important step to that regard, to show like-minded scientists the ability to collaborate remains. So yes, war is a very polarizing phenomenon that blurs nuances into black and whites. And I think we should just be very considerate of the fact that scientific cooperation often, in certain ways, in some senses, it can be a vehicle for war, but not in every way. And we should be careful of the ones that are not a vehicle of war when we're cutting our ties.
Well, thank you, Eric. Ivy Young, you are next. Please, the microphone and the screen is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Morten. Hi, everyone. My name is Ivy. I'm currently a doctoral researcher at the University of Warwick and also a visiting fellow at the UNUCRIS with Eric as well. So my research looks into the artificial intelligence and digital policies from the angle of the EU in light of the geopolitical tensions between the United States and China. So a core lesson that it can be drawn on from that angle to the broader consideration of EU's positioning or navigation in the broader geopolitical challenge is that, well, regarding science diplomacy, it's on the one aspect, it is about acknowledging the importance of science in our today's development. Hence, we see, there are several versions of conceptualization frameworks like the ones offered by AAAS on exploring and highlighting the role of science in our today's discussion. However, but when we take a look at the geopolitical angle, it is fairly clear that a lot of times the issues is not the simple recognition of the importance of science itself. Rather, it is a securitization and politicization of science collaborations by geopolitical motivations. So if we take a look at current development regarding Russia, it is not about the Western countries not realizing the long engagement of Russia in various aspects of vital science science fields, like space science, cybersecurity, climate, Arctic resource, etc. The point is the Western countries have been using the science collaborations as bargaining chips, as a tool to push Russia to give in. From the geopolitical perspective, from the political angle, I mean, it is clear that why this is happening, because I mean, the objective of that by the Western countries is to use that to mitigate the security risk imposed by Russia from the perspective of these countries. But then a question worth asking is termination of these scientific collaborations an effective tool to achieve the goal of reducing such security risks? The simple answers of my answers to that is no. It is in fact more damaging because it overlooks the collateral damage that this would cost in other fields, in other areas, scientific developments, which will lead to more security risks going forward. It's simply not sustainable. So this can at least be seen from two aspects. First aspect is it simply only creates lose-lose situation. The purpose of introducing these measures is for the way to punish or to pushing Russia to give in. However, as much as it is hurting Russia, it's also hurting the interests of the Western countries as well. Just to take a look think about how much time, resource, and effort that Western scientists have to put in to compensate the cost that caused by cutting off Russia completely. And as much as this is halting the development from the Russia ground, it's also halting the progress from the Western's perspective, its own development in this vital scientific fields. The second aspect, which I think it is even more alarming, is that by using these scientific collaborations as bargaining chips, it's in fact feeding into this hostile competitive environment among actors. We'll take a look at what is being going on right now. I mean, it is already super difficult to bring actors with different ideologies on the same table to work out some solutions collaboratively on addressing the issues, the challenges we're facing today. See all these issues, the space science, and then the energy, climate, and cybersecurity. All of these issues are beyond borders. So it's inevitable to deal with actors with different ideologies, and the collaboration on these matters are desperately needed at our current age in order to go forward. So hence, that I think that introducing these measures as bargaining chips is simply more dividing than uniting in the areas that we desperately need collaboration going forward. So to conclude, the message that I'm trying to push today is simple. So I think in general that we should stop weaponizing science collaborations. Because why? It is simply overlook the collateral damage that would cause more security risk going forward. So simply put, don't be short-sighted. So that's my point. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ivy. And then we will hear from Olaf Witkowski. Olaf, tell us where you're coming from, and the screen is yours.
Thank you, Morten. Olaf Witkowski from Cross Labs and the University of Tokyo in Japan. And I work in AI research and connect with the automation industry, I guess, mostly manufacturing in Japan. For me, I'm in favor of really freezing the relations in the short term. I believe we have no choice. I would advocate for a radical freeze. Of course, there are many minutiae points, but for what concerns academic collaborations at the institutional level, I think we need to do it and do it now. And of course, while maintaining relations with individual scientists and support them as much as we can. The reason for freezing, I think, are multiple, but all pretty simple. We need to avoid as much as possible loopholes during the sanctions to make them effective. And it's, I think, worth it if we can save even one life from the slaughter that is happening in Ukraine. Otherwise, aren't we condoning the acts of violence and crime against humanity that are happening right now? Yeah, as unfortunate as it is, I think Russian science at this moment needs to be shunned, and as well as everything else that is part of the state, sports, Russian economy, because arguably, yeah, some things are maybe more urgent than, yeah, in the pyramid of needs than what science can accomplish, and I'm a firm believer in everything scientific. The point is that I'm not Russian. I'm Belgian, Polish, Vietnamese, other things, but I would support freezing even if I were Russian. And science, I think, is all about those information flows between individuals. So we have to maintain that, right? We need to gain knowledge together as a scholarly community. And we can't really take middle ways. But I think science evolves at the pace of discussion. It's especially true for AI research. What we see in the industry and in academia right now, it's much faster than anything we've seen before in terms of research. It's completely different and can be weaponized in a very significant way, as we all know. So this is especially important in my field. I feel very concerned but that any kind of research in AI could be used as a weapon rather directly. And we would be playing in that game immediately. So I agree that in the longer term, I think, yeah, what I heard before, I completely agree with. In the context of a Cold War, scientific exchange can really help. So I would say, especially in this longer term, we need to maintain, even strengthen this, this cultivation of personal relations with our colleagues, scientists, other scholars in Russia. But for now, freeze any kind of institutional collaboration, especially anything involving money or helping any tech being developed for the reasons I mentioned. So in the light of this AI research, which is my personal perspective, I guess, that can be weaponized and so on. We don't have a choice. We need to freeze those collaborations. Again, that's the scale of the institution, and we won't let go. We won't abandon our colleagues, scientists all around the world. I think we need to support that more than ever.
Thank you, Olaf. So Pierre Roussel, please introduce yourself and the screen and the microphone is yours.
Okay, thank you. Well, there's an interesting diversity of viewpoints here. I'm the president of Inspiring Futures, a Swiss-based company, and I'm a futurist, and I am also a retiree from the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Lausanne, EPFL. And as such, I've had Russian students and colleagues for the last 30 years. And so maybe as I'm a bit more senior than others here, I may recall at least two things that are really interesting to connect with the current situation that is not so new after all. I always, every year, I had to decide with colleagues of mine, of course, not alone, if we wanted to recruit or accept as a master or PhD students, engineers from Iran. And not knowing what whatever training we would provide might end up with in the end. And so it's a very interesting problem that we have now. My belief is that we should, on the contrary of what was said, maintain a certain level of dialogue and diplomacy. And diplomacy is about maintaining dialogue, including with people you don't agree with. The most interesting experience I had was actually led by, for about 25 or 30 years, Nobel Prize winners of CERN at Erice in Sicily, where physicists from the Soviet Union and the Western world gathered each year to discuss, physics issues. And some Russian Soviet physicists discussed that under the surveillance of colleagues who were not so much physicists, but supervisors, let's say. Still, I believe that this constant discussion and dialogue line that has been maintained between the two sides over the years has somehow contributed to the fall of the Soviet Union. And to some extent, I believe that cutting this line of dialogue, of capacity to maintain an open line, even with an enemy sometimes, is a risky business. Of course, we can make distinctions, between different types of collaborations. It's not the same thing as if you have an invitee for study ancient Greek or nuclear weapons. It's not the same thing, obviously. And there may be distinctions, but as a general comment, I think diplomacy is the capacity to maintain things open a little bit, and hopefully with the idea that some of the fruits of this bet will, flourish and end up in being profitable for even the cause we try to defend. So that's my personal experience. And of course, I'm well aware of the ethical reasons that would push us to freeze, as it was said, the situation. But well, for some reasons, I think, one of the proofs of what I'm saying is that Russian personals, scientists, let's say in the Western world right now have a difficult time. And they are most of the time, convinced of what we say here, and probably our best ambassadors the day they go back. And so for all these reasons, I would be rather an advocate of non-freezing, or at least be cautious in what we freeze and where we don't freeze.
Thank you, Pierre. And then our last colleague around the table here, Pierre Bruno Ruffini. Please, Pierre, the audience is yours.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Pierre Bruno Ruffini. I'm a professor at the University of Florida in Normandy in France. Several years ago, I was a counselor for science and technology at the French embassy in Moscow. So I would maybe like to address the topic of the war in Ukraine from the perspective of science diplomacy. Science as diplomacy is the title of this conversation, and science as diplomacy is a part of science diplomacy. And if we translate science as diplomacy to individuals, we could say scientists as diplomats, or at least as informal diplomats. And this is an interesting starting point. I should recall that a basic assumption of science diplomacy is that international scientific collaborations can bring a positive influence on international relations. So this is an optimistic view, of course. This is one point to start. But another point is also to understand that view from the side of scientists and scientific organizations, science diplomacy is an engagement in society, whether scientists are aware of it or not. So in that sense, science diplomacy is always political in the broader meaning of the word political. That said, in the context of the war, I think science diplomacy has a very particular way. The first question I would address is about the engagement of scientists as far as the war in Ukraine is concerned. Scientists feel, I feel that it's difficult maybe to keep business as usual in the present situation with our colleagues in Russia. From statements of various organizations and prominent scholars, I understand that there are two levels of engagement. The first level is to protest and to condemn and to claim support to Ukrainian scientists. That's one thing. The second level is about freezing scientific ties. And freezing scientific ties means that we're speaking about scientific sanctions, and we're having scientific collaborations or scientific partnership entering the field of political sanctions. Why? Obviously not for scientific reasons, but if I try to examine what are the reasons that can drive scientists and their organizations into scientific sanction, I think that there is a mix of different feelings. Maybe pacifism. We know that there is a tradition of pacifism among the scientific community. The sense of solidarity, ethical motivations probably as well. Patriotism maybe also. I would like to maybe say one thing. Of course, we do know about those scientists in Russia that have signed this statement, opposing the war and expressing, I think we can understand immediately. But at the same time, you may have heard also of this statement by more than 200 rectors of Russian universities, strongly backing their government from some kind of patriotic reasons, maybe. So the question is, it was already addressed about the effectiveness of sanctions. For sure, scientific sanctions will not stop the war. And when the war stops, it's hardly to believe that things will turn out as usual, as normal situation. And we will probably have several years of kind of frozen conflict or difficult tensions between countries surrounding the Ukrainian thing. I should recall this basic thing that the time scale of research is not the one of politics or of economics. It's much longer. So freezing scientific collaborations, to my understanding, will not damage anything, will not exert any kind of pressure on any political authority in Russia. So freezing sanctions is, to my understanding, more of a moral attitude. And of course, their effectiveness is maybe more symbolical. Symbols, image, what you're doing, what your conscience says is, of course, no less important. The second question is, what about science diplomacy in time of war? Is it useful? We had examples before in this panel of the way in which scientific collaboration during the Cold War could mitigate or maintain bridges between the East and West, or also during the period where there were no diplomatic relations between the US and Cuba. That's certain. We have this idea that scientific changes are probably the last category of relations to be impacted when relations between countries get bad. And they could be also the first category of exchanges to resurface when relations between countries normalize. I would like to distinguish what was the pre-war period. Let's go back to 2014, the annexion of Crimea and starting the war in the Donbass. At that time, countries in the West decided to put economic sanctions on Russia, but we did not put any scientific sanctions. As far as I remember, the question was not put forward. So what happened since then? What happened is the collaboration between, scientific collaboration between Russia and the West could continue normally. We have very good records of collaboration between Russia and other countries, whereas political situation continuously got worse, deteriorated between Russia and most of the Western countries. So that's what it says, that there is a great distance, maybe a disconnect between the stance of scientific collaboration and the stance of geopolitics, the sense of politics, you see? And in that sense, we should not overstate the power of science diplomacy. We should not overstate the power of scientific collaboration to interfere, to mitigate, or to impact on geopolitical relations. That's one thing. During the war period, now, we are in the war period. I think that science diplomacy is not really possible. This is not the best time for science diplomacy. During the war, diplomacy stands at the backstage, and so does science diplomacy, probably. Sooner or later, the war will stop, and we have to think about that. And this is what we call the post-war period. We have to think right now, not waiting for any peace agreement or stopping of the war. We have to think right now how science diplomacy can resume, can express itself during the post-war period. How? One thing is to allow sanctions to be reversible, scientific sanctions. And looking at various statements from organizations that have given statements about freezing, that have recommended freezing, we can read things like, we will freeze until the evolution of the situation makes it possible to reconsider this rule, or as long as the situation requires. This is cautious. I think this is fine, because it means that the door is not locked, and we can reverse such scientific sanctions as freezing of international partnerships. We have to keep channels open, of course, to keep as much as possible the role of science as a platform for dialogue. And it's often said that science diplomacy is the way to bridge, between countries and people when situation is difficult. So the bridge, for now, the bridges of scientific cooperation, there is nobody on the bridges, but still we have to keep the bridge as they are, not to destroy them, of course. So I think that in the post-war period, science diplomacy has a role to play without overstating, overestimating the role of science diplomacy. I think that scientists as individuals and through their organizations, they can be helpful. And this has to be prepared now.
So do we have a danger of ending in a two separate ditches? One saying boycott, and the other saying diplomacy. Isn't there, what I hear from Pierre Bruno is that, well, it's not that black and white. I don't know if I read you correctly, but I will ask some pointed questions around the table. I'll see if I get around. So to Ivy, could I ask you, the European University Association has suspended 12 Russian universities because their rectors, these universities were members of the European University Association, but the rectors have signed a letter supporting the war. From your perspective, do you believe it was wrong of the European University Association to suspend those universities from their association?
Well, in general, I think, well, thanks for the question. I mean, in general, it is a very difficult question to see black and white, what is right and what is wrong. But then at the same time, one thing is certain, that the difficult positions that research center has been stuck in this, as a consequence, is also to some extent, I mean, because when you look at the nature of research institutions, the goal of research institutions is to stimulate scientific collaborations across different subjects, right? But then now they are being put in the position by having to choose itself is very concerning. So the problem is not right or wrong. The problem is like how we end up to the position that to get scientific collaboration into this position at the first place. So hence that in my concept, in my intervention at the very beginning, I highlighted the point that it is not about, in a logical scenario, in a rational or in a long-term scenario, we see, the role of science to our future developments from the logical perspective. It's rather, it is the whole procedure is rather emotional. So it's a securitization and a politicization. So it is not about science itself per se anymore. It's about political willingness. The objectives from the political angle that push the different actor has to put it in, has to collaborate on a certain way. So it's it's easy to anticipate that how we end up to this position, but I would encourage everyone to reflect on what had made us to be in this position at the first place. And then the actual cost of that is actually maybe the core thing that we need to reflect on. And hence that I was calling that it's not the smartest idea to weaponize, to securitize scientific collaborations in general. Simply, it is just the collateral damage that we can expect more coming forward. So don't aim for something relatively short term at expense of something will come to us in the longer term.
So I will ask Olaf a question, but to all of you, you just raise your hand. You don't need to do the electronic hand raising. You just raise your hand if you want to ask a question to anybody around the table. To Olaf, I'll ask you the following. The Norwegian government has sent out a letter to every university and university college in Norway, where they're saying that as of immediately, we are putting all scientific collaboration and all institutional scientific collaboration on hold, while also saying we are not advocating scientific boycott. Does that make sense? Do you think it's too, is it just a moral pause in order to be able to is it, basically institutional collaboration mean, for instance, then funded projects from Norway will then, that means we have to send money to Russia. Can we send money to Russia and look the Ukrainians in the eye, even if it's scientific? And is it possible to sort this out? I mean, what can we collaborate on and what can't we collaborate on? Is it even possible? Olaf, there was more than one question, but go ahead.
Yeah, this is so difficult. I must say, first, I resonate with everyone here. It's and I think each of us are digging on a sort of very complicated object, and we are six people on a cube here, and we're trying to dig what is the right answer to solve this cube, and it's so difficult. And the question that you're asking now is difficult because, of course, the individual and the institutional are linked in many ways. This being said, in my practice, I think that it's possible to envisage a freezing in terms of institution, in terms of everything that would be at that level, and still maintain very strong relations. An example that I have in mind is, so I was a member for a few years at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton that came out of the Cold War, basically. Situation, and it showed very strong ties with Russia, like between the US and Russia, maybe many arguable points in there, but it shows really that you can have and maintain strengthened relations at the personal level and advanced science without recognizing the institution per se and the state's decision. I think it's more complicated than that, but I think it's possible. But I agree with Pierre Bruno's point. Was answering that too. I think it's basically we are in a hot war situation. It's nothing comparable with what in the future will be possible in the Cold War.
So, Erik, does it make sense to pause and take stock and sort things out, or is that also a signal that is too close to boycott, in your opinion?
Well, I think the EU's mantra when it comes to international scientific collaboration is open as possible, but as closed as necessary. I mean, of course, during war times, it is a different situation, but I think we should still approach the situation with that sort of ideas, as open as possible, as closed as necessary. It is very tricky, I agree. And to send money to Russia, how will that look in the eyes of Ukrainians? But I think there should be a criteria that sort of analyzes what is the scientific project in question. And I think if it is a project that is in fulfillment of the UN SDGs, then it is something that don't think should be another victim of the sanctions, because it's not helping anybody. It's not harming the Kremlin, and it's not helping our objectives with war. And just regards to the institutionalization aspect, I mean, the diplomatic institutions are still open and functioning. And science diplomacy you could see as a way of achieving diplomatic objectives through science. And as a result, if diplomatic channels are open, then to have some scientific diplomatic channels open as well, that raises that question, I think.
So I will challenge you, Ivy, to ask a question to anybody around the table. And when you have done that, I will ask Pierre Bruno to do the same, or to just pass the baton on to somebody else to do that.
Sure. Well, then I will explore this opportunity to ask, all the great minds on this panel myself. So as mentioned, that my research looks into this artificial intelligence policies, and then this kind of geopolitical dynamic that, I'm wondering that from your, so, when I'm looking at, this role of, science diplomacy, on the one hand, is a diplomacy aspect. On the other hand, that it's about the engagement of scientists, scientific knowledges. And one thing is very interesting to me that, in the past, when it's about how we talked about scientists as a group. Is there really a unilateral group of scientists? Or where do scientists exist in various aspects of the society, right? So, I mean, this is not a very mature idea on my end yet, but I think it's just something to interest to think about it. When we simply think about the scientific or the science diplomacy, that we automatically try to assume that is engagement of the scientific aspect or the engagement of scientists. But nowadays we say there are quite some scientists, and now in the private sector, they're having own businesses. So their motivation or their perspective in the discussion might not purely from the traditional sense that how we would expect that a scientist would aim for. Rather, there are so many different layers of other, the other considerations based on the roles, the roles that he or she plays in the cross discipline. So I'm curious of hearing from your perspective as well. So to challenge this kind of maybe the broadening the understanding of science diplomacy, because the reason why we are here today is not to simply have a theoretical conversation about what science diplomacy is rather than to scratch the problem to see what is a pragmatic, aspect of this can help us to solve a real problem we're facing today. The reason why I'm pushing for this angle to rethink the role of scientists or the multi-role, the different roles that a scientist, the traditional science can play in this dialogue, maybe that will open our perspective onto exploring the potential of engagement, the practice of science diplomacy, maybe not from the traditional angle, but from the other angle to penetrate the whole process, that so to maybe mitigate the risk. I'm curious to hear from your views on this.
Should I just point at Pierre Rossel, for instance? I mean, since you are so shy, everybody, and don't raise your hands. I'm the teacher.
Okay, just a question or comment very briefly before going into some other considerations. You talked about the main challenge is that we have to solve a problem. I don't think we are in position of solving anything. We are in a position of contributing. And one way or another, through our decisions and common stance, science being a professional community. And so, because there is diplomacy as a science and science as diplomacy. And so we should also, as Pierre Bruno distinguished, the level of discussions. I mean, if it's to condemn, it's one thing. But what to do is another thing. And what to do should be non-emotional as possible. The condemnation is emotional and rightfully so. So it's more about the game theory, what we have to gain, what we have to lose. And it's not only a black or white. I mean, it's we may decide to maintain some of the things open and some of the things closed, and so it's a more sophisticated discussions that just deciding quickly, we should stop and contribute to make sure that there is no ethical compromission. No, I think it's on the contrary, and history showed on several occasions that it's worthwhile taking the time at least to find a consistent posture.
Some of you, probably all of you, may know who said that the country that leads in artificial intelligence will rule the world. Who was that?
Putin.
Yes, that was Vladimir Putin. So that goes back to what we can do and the limits to what we should do, which are different things. Should we collaborate in AI, artificial intelligence, and cybersecurity? That seems like something we shouldn't at the moment, at least. Should we collaborate in history? Well, even that is problematic at the moment on the Russian side, because of the different views of what history, what the real history is and has been. So the question then becomes, instead of, pausing, taking stock, finding out what to do next. One way is to say, okay, there are things we maybe should avoid for a while, but what about establishing another type of more active scientific diplomacy with a clear goal? At one point, Putin will be out of office in one way or another. What kind of Russia will emerge, will come out from that? And to which degree will there be a scientific community, an academic community that will support and advise the next government? Or will it be, will the scientific community in Russia be ignored in the next government too? Question is, we don't know. We don't know that, but we can prepare for that situation to be there. The worst we can do is that there is a vacuum there at the time, the day that it is needed. Is this so? In one way, that is a middle thing between boycott and diplomacy is being very targeted about how we do scientific collaboration. Or am I very naive here now? Please let me know. Pierre Bruno, am I naive? Just say it.
Just to say once again that during the period of the hot war, we think emotionally and not rationally, not enough, with enough rationality. That's one thing. And during the hottest point of the conflict, as now, it's really difficult to stay and to just look and not to do anything. So this, to me, the reason that explains a reaction to the scientific community on the West, and also explain the freezing decisions by some of those scientific organizations. But there is one thing important about sanctions. The point is to get out of sanctions without losing face. You decide to put sanctions, okay, but when will you stop those sanctions? We can imagine that some sort of, complicated situation will follow. Not exactly the war, but not the peace for sure. It may last months. And what will happen? Freezing of sanctions still? So that's a difficult question. I know from about the sanction, the one that were put in 2014. I remember quite well a talk I had with a scientific council at the Russian embassy in Paris for the sanction. I could speak frankly with this person. We spoke about the sanctions between the EU, US, Canada, Australia towards Russia. And he said, the problem is how can we get out of those sanctions without losing face on both sides? Of course, we are speaking of economic sanctions that had lasted 7, 8, 10 years, or almost 8 years. And here we are speaking about 3 weeks of sanctions, you see, decision. But this is one point which seems to be important. Another point I would like to look at, maybe following what Ivy could say. The question I have is there something specific about the scientific community as such, which would lead the scientific community to convey a specific message that other categories of people in the society could not convey with, well, they could not convey the same kind of message. If we look at the characteristics of the scientific community, very you know, straightforwardly, we have people that have knowledge. It doesn't mean that they're wiser people, but they have knowledge. They are international in mind. I mean that all of us, most of our collaborations are with people outside of our country, I guess. And as far as natural sciences are concerned, at minimum, there are the so-called universal values of sciences. So it seems to me that all this drives the scientific community to have a more open attitude towards any kind of geopolitical problem. Probably the scientific community is more open. This could explain also what I made a reminder of tradition of pacifism, internationalism of science. But once again, when we're in a hot war, the reflex of scientists on both sides are precisely to take sides pro Russia, against Russia, you see? And I think this is not escapable. We cannot avoid that because scientists are human beings anyhow. And citizenship in some parts of the stories, citizenship may be more important than the universal belonging to the universal community of scientists.
Well, okay, so we have a geopolitical situation that is dire also. It's not only the war in a narrow, in an area of the world. And the West has responded to Putin's aggression with a new type of hybrid war. It's a mix of economical power and soft power, business, culture, sport. I have mentioned before, even the International Cat Association has severed their ties to Russian, the Russian chapter. And in doing that, it's a total sum in some way or another that is important. And this is what you call a weaponization of science, of culture, of. So the question is that so bad if the alternative had been a hot war? I mean, what else can we do? So if it's the total sum that is important, is that a wrong question? Is it a wrong question to be asked, and is this the wrong approach to be taken, Ivy?
Can I intervene? Oh, no, yeah. Ivy. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, Pierre, intervene, and then we go to Ivy afterwards.
Yeah.
Just about naive or not, or wrong or good question. I mean, there are no bad questions, but just for the AI and Putin's tradition in AI, we were at war much before the war, I tell you. I'm very close to that domain, and we have been in war with Russia for about 10 years in cybersecurity.
Yes.
Every day, and very in a severe manner and very frightening way. So the Ukraine war was just a shift in the same type of environment for those who are accustomed to the use of AI for attacking assets and consistency. So just the naive point of that was to ask, is it new? I mean, but in fact, we have been at war in that particular domain for a long time. And we had already, much before the Ukraine attack, to be extremely cautious in how we deal with that particular problem, much before.
Ivy.
Yeah, so going back to what you asked about whether there's, if I'm understanding this correctly, you're asking there if, you know, like so in my point that I was calling for stop weaponizing scientific collaborations. And then your question is, then what is the alternative? So what might be the alternative? Am I understanding this correctly?
Yeah, yes.
Okay.
Except just maintaining open channels as nothing has happened.
Right. I mean, I think this, I want to refer to earlier that what Craig Russell mentioned, you know, in my previous intervention that he mentioned about, he said something about a solution. I mean, I know that we're very optimistic here. And if we can find that silver bullet, the magic pill that we can just end all this chaos right away, I guess a lot of people right now willing to fight over for that pill and to have problem to be solved. So I mean, of course, what we're having here is it's too optimistic to try to find one thing that can solve all. But what we're searching here is a direction. So that in line with what you asked about, you know, alternatives. I mean, there's no simple question to that. I mean, we can, as Per Bruno mentioned, that it's very challenging to separate science away from politics. And as that's my point, that when I mentioned about this politicization, securitization, about scientific collaborations, and it's not about scientific collaboration itself, rather than geopolitical motivations behind that is a driving force that have caused the development of such. Then the question is, and why? So what has made, you know, what has caused, if we take a step further to see that what has caused the geopolitical dynamics or geopolitical motivations to have developed, to have prioritized this approach among any other approaches, then I think, you know, there are several elements you can look into it that due to the time, I'm just going to name a couple. You know, one aspect that we can't, you know, forget about the role of public's place in this process, that how the narrative is being told. You know, because when I was approached about this panel, that a question really puzzles me right now is, how come that when there's a conflict happening that the world is so actively talking about, everywhere is on the front line is talking about what is going on, but why have we given enough attention to the collaborations, the positive development in the past? Have they received enough attentions that among, you know, how we convey that to the public and how we're highlighting that in educations with our future generations, on to reinforce? It's a mindset change. It's a perception change. It's not about in a short term, should we do that? Should we do not? It's a logic that needs to, maybe we should rethink about the logic that we've taken for granted of thinking about these issues. And that goes into not just about the geopolitical levels or the political considerations or scientific consideration. That goes into deeper about education, about public engagement, about, you know, involving how do we communicate? Are we using a more effective way of communicating and highlighting the opposite aspect of this collaboration beforehand and afterwards, and so that might change, you know, the worldviews that we're viewing these issues in general.
So we have little time left. So I will ask Erik a question, and then I will have a short answer, and Olaf will get the last question. Now, Erik, aren't we academics talking, while the reality is that when you are faced with a gun, the choices become easy. The choices become black and white. Are we just too far away from the realities to accept that gray zones now go out of the window, Erik?
Oh, the fog of war is a real thing. I think it's impossible to understand the whole situation. And yeah, here I am sitting at my house in Brussels, trying to, and I know that whatever ideas that I come up with, or what fantastic ideas we're talking about, I don't think they are actually realistically applicable in a war that keeps unfolding every minute.
But still, we are talking about it, and we talk very long paragraphs.
And I think short of actually going and helping the situation in Ukraine in some way, I think this is we're doing the best we can to apply our knowledge to try to come up with solutions. Whether or not it might be a futile effort, but I think putting it onto the spectrum and discussing it and raising awareness about different points of view, it's been very valuable for me to hear all of your perspectives. And I think we can take that and work with it. And maybe one day we can apply it into something that has tangible positive effects.
So Olaf, I was obviously a bit unfair to Eric because we are scientists and we have our own tools that we are using. And with your tools, you have a question you wanted to ask, so shoot. And that was not the right word to use today, sorry. State your question or your comment.
Thank you, Morten. I guess on AI, which is my everyday work, and the weaponization of science is really at its heart, right? My point was about information. Not only theory, information geometry, and so on, but really the texture of information, which is truth and trust, something that is the scariest right now with what is possible and what we understand being in the field we are capable of now with the information technology. I'm sure you've seen that what is happening. I follow some news in Russian. It's a very different story. What it is there, the information war, is something that like Pierre and Pierre Bruno mentioned has been happening for a while. It wasn't just in this war, and so my group also works against cyber attacks and so on, trying to protect systems from being hacked and so on. This is very difficult to work on, and it's basically it's basically a sort of an arms race. Social media is the first thing that people see are being touched on both sides. There are many interests that we have to deal with, and my question is about this information. I think science has something to say. We have a method to deal with information. Otherwise, we wouldn't have constructed this big building that helps us exercise our job as scientists. I think there is an opposition between diplomacy that is about arguing empathy and so on, and science as search for the truth. And this is solved in a sort of an information flow. I guess that joins with what we talked about, not destroying those bridges of information, but still having the right constraints on them. So that's, I guess, an open question.
Well, to all of you and to everybody listening, I will briefly come back to the first question. The first question was how can we help? Yes, we are scientists. We can help by through our work, and we can target our work more towards areas that could help. But right now, there are 3 million refugees, Ukrainian refugees outside of Ukraine. There is huge displacement within Ukraine. And right now, what we have is a humanitarian crisis. There are simple things that come before discussions really about scientific freeze or scientific diplomacy, and that is water, it's food, it's shelter. There are international organizations dealing with that. We must help them. Do what you can. The second phase is that there are a huge number of students on the run, young people. We have ways to bring them in to our programs, and we need to look at that as well. And the third one is that we have academics, refugee academics that could and the refugees have been given a 3-year stay in Europe, which is makes it possible for us wherever we can and whenever we can to hire academics into temporary positions, teaching either Ukrainian students or teaching on English speaking programs or similarly. There are so many ways we can do things, and I would like to just point your attention to Scholars at Risk and at Science for Ukraine, and then go and knock on the door of your rector or your principal at your institutions and say, I think we can do something more here. Thank you so much for the conversation. I look forward to talk to you again. This isn't over, unfortunately, and I think we will need to discuss more to see how we can optimally move towards the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.